Hello, everyone. My name is Deepansh, and I am your moderator for this roundtable, which is innovating with Shiny and large language models, building interactive data applications in the ChatGPT era. I mean, everyone is talking about it, so we figured why not talk about it ourselves. And today we have a great panel here with us, and we'll start with Marek. Marek is the CTO at Epsilon, but at this point, we could call him the biggest fan and proponent of ChatGPT. Within a few hours of ChatGPT's release, Marek made his first plot using it and has been running experiments since to augment the life of the R Shiny developer. In fact, if you follow him on social media, he has already generated a fully functional R Shiny app using GPT-4, which was released just yesterday. So if fans are concerned, Marek is the biggest one here. It is
Hi,
always exciting to talk to you, Marek, and I'm sure this panel will be fun with you in it. Welcome.
pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone.
Next up, we have David Kais. If you know R for the rest of us, you probably know David already. He is the founder and CEO of this popular resource that makes R accessible to everyone and makes it more fun. And in his words, he wants to help people avoid the pain he went through while learning it. R for the rest of us also does reporting and consulting and other work for organizations as well. I'm particularly looking forward to your views, David, since I know you've been dabbling with AI capabilities, not to mention Convivio AI. Your recent blog post made me curious about qualitative data analysis because it made me remember all the times I was doing user studies on whiteboards and Excel sheets and just going through all that text. I think that will make my life definitely easier.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to talking with folks.
Now, unfortunately, I know we said Jose Fernandez would be joining us today, but because of some unforeseen delays with his travel, he could not make it. But we are joined by the esteemed Eric Nantz. Eric is a name as synonymous with R and R Shiny as it can get. He is the director within the Statistical Innovation Center at Eli Lilly and Company. You just saw him on the Shiny Dev Series live, and if you are here, most likely you have heard his podcast, which was launched in 2012. He is also the curator for the R Weekly project and the co-host of the R Weekly Highlights podcast, which goes in tandem with it. But most of all, for most of us developers, he is a role model. Also, he is a good sport and a lifesaver for spontaneously agreeing to be a part of this panel and getting us out of a fix. Thank you, Eric. Since you mentioned you have a lot to say about GPT, I'm ecstatic to hear your thoughts as well.
I'm happy to be here. Glad I can pitch in and be a part of this exciting panel.
Awesome. So before we begin, I want to warm up a little, and we'll do a fun exercise. And since this is a video format, we'll do it once with each person. So the idea is that I'll say a word or a phrase, and you have to tell me the first thing that comes to your mind when I say that. For example, for me, if I say R, easy analysis comes to my mind immediately, almost like that. So starting with Marek, what do you think of when I say shiny?
Speed of development and experimentation.
Awesome. Now, David, what do you think of when I say AI?
What do I think of? Gosh, so many things. I kind of think of it as a black box because while I'm excited about it, I don't know that I particularly understand what's going on inside that black box.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with that sentiment, definitely. And lastly, Eric, if I say ChatGPT, what comes to your mind?
Cautious. I think it is very innovative, but I'm also trying to figure out the best use cases for it, which I'm sure we're going to hash out over here.
Yeah,
Oh,
awesome.
absolutely.
That's all of those good answers. So I think we're all warmed up now, and I'll just throw out the first question or prompt. What do we call that? And since we're talking about ChatGPT, so it could be called a prompt. And so, how do you see ChatGPT and other large language models transforming the landscape of data applications built with Shiny or otherwise, specifically in the kind of applications that they can augment?
So the landscape of data applications. So I would say broadly, I see two areas here. Like one is how we develop applications. So the software development process, the design process, And the other one is actually implementing the features in those apps that use language models to empower the users. So I think these are two streams that are kind of different. And one thing that comes to my mind is that earlier this year, when I first experimented with ChatGPT, I said to my friends at Epsilon that it's going to be hard to keep up with the progress the next year. And right now, I exactly feel this is happening, right? So it's actually hard to predict how fast this will happen, and the process of transformation. I think what I'm worried about is the kind of great divide. I think the pace of adopting those technologies will be super uneven. There's those early adopters will be on the newest model, while other people, I recently talked to some friends and they never heard of ChatGPT, and I was like, how is this possible? But it is possible, and for sure, majority of people on Earth never heard of it. So it's kind of this great AI divide. That's kind of what I'm worried about, and also this will affect businesses. So kind of I think there will be huge changes to how things look.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I've seen. So first of all, I'll preface this all by saying I'm actually not a Shiny user, but coming at it from the outside, I think one thing that I could see happening is the way that people work with the types of data and apps that are now done with Shiny could change. So as an example, I came across an app, a web app recently called Census GPT, which allows you as the user to ask questions. Just, it's obviously using ChatGPT under the hood. And I mean, I'm looking at it on my other screen, so it says what are the 5 cities in Florida with the highest crime rate? And it'll return results. And I think it actually even shows it to you on a map. And so the way that, an end user can interact, I think can be changed significantly by having access to ChatGPT. Whereas, now, again, as not a Shiny user, but as someone who develops things within R a lot, thinking, having to think about, well, what are the different ways people might want to, work with this data or slice it in different ways. That may be that mode of developing apps and how people interact with them. I could see it potentially changing as we incorporate ChatGPT to allow people to interact in ways we don't even foresee when we develop whatever kinds of apps we do.
Yeah, these are great points. I think the part, as someone kind of new to using these models in this space and coming from life sciences, this is another reason why I said the word cautious, because we have to be extremely careful about these other tooling that we put into production with our existing workflows. But the part that I see great potential in is that when you have a data analysis that's trying to leverage existing data or from other sources, and you're trying to figure out what can best match with your current analysis. And I got inspired by, ironically, preparing for the earlier podcast I released this morning. I talked about in our weekly issue a great post about augmenting a Shiny app that was searching for economic articles, but then augmenting the search hits that based on a keyword with results from running an OpenAI, GPT-like model to find similar articles in that particular space. So you can kind of get a nice network of related materials. So I feel like bringing together disparate sources of information, I see as a huge step that these tools, I think, can be a great assistance with. Now, I tried the early days of ChatGPT with some very simple Shiny app development, and it left results to be desired. But given what I've seen lately, I think that's coming around nicely. So I can definitely, at the early point, see this as a great augment to maybe solving some thorny development issues, maybe integrating Shiny with other frameworks that I just don't have as much expertise in. If they can give me a snippet that I can extend very easily versus an hour of search engine trial and error, heck, I'm all for it.
Yeah, or even, and there's a new package that you want to try out, you just copy and paste the documentation, and bam, it's like learning is shortened to like a couple minutes basically, and you can already play with it. So
And I think if we combine what David said about prompts and how users interact with things, and what you just said, Eric, about life sciences and critical domains, we could actually go towards another side of it, which is where do we draw the line and why? And do we think that biases and error can prove to be a challenge, or straight up render applications where, let's say, these prompts and interactions are a huge part? And let's take an illustration, for example, where we send a prompt and the data is requested by the model itself. Now, would the biases and error rates make it a bad fit? Do you have anything to weigh in on that from a life sciences perspective?
I mean, this is an area we're very cautious about, where when we want to leverage these models internally, what are they being trained on? And if we're evaluating them with the right sources of information inside of it, that's why I think it's going to be a bit slower for some of these major big ticket items for development of like clinical designs, or in the case of, say, real world analytics, trying to find the best source of information without biasing our basic training sets that we might use to evaluate real world usage of a treatment, and et cetera. So that's a part I get concerned about, is kind of like what we heard even in the panel I just led, the black box syndrome of how did these models get to where they are, and can we depend on bias not creeping in if we try to leverage it in what might be a smaller use case, a smaller set of data that we're trying to predict from, based on the massive amounts of training data, what results are we really going to get? So I think for me, trying to have that, you might say, open mind, but yet also the right guardrails around interpretability is going to be an issue that I think many of us in the industry are still wrestling with, how to best adapt that to the use cases at hand.
Would you want to add something towards that, Marek or David?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I see a lot of risks actually here. Like I'm absolutely enthusiastic, but still I see a lot of risks. Kind of like one of the big risks when it comes to this stream of how we develop applications, so writing code, which is I think really promising, is one is the confidentiality of the code. Like right now it runs on the servers, so you send the code to the all the data to OpenAI, and this basically means that we cannot use this in most projects for our clients. So maintaining this confidentiality, ensuring that this will not ever leak anywhere or be used in training future versions is kind of a big risk. But also it's unclear, like the ethical aspect of the code that is generated. It's essentially based on code that has been written by different people on GitHub with different licenses, and it doesn't seem to me that they cared about this aspect that much when collecting the data. So it's unclear. There have been reports that someone saw their code like almost one-to-one generated by ChatGPT. Like the same code that they wrote in their open source library. What will be the license aspects of the code that is generated, and are we allowed basically to sell this code as something that we wrote ourselves? that's another risk. But I'm really curious about your perspective, Eric, because pharma is super important to us, and as a highly regulated industry, I think it's like we can learn a lot and understand a lot of how businesses will approach those models. And I'm curious, like it's clear to me that you cannot use kind of generated stuff like maybe code, or you cannot perform analysis in language models for pharma. But do you see it, like, is it realistic in your opinion that that you could use those models in non-critical stuff, like for example user interfaces? I can imagine that, and actually we've been talking about some clients about this kind of applications where you simply make it easier for people to input a large amount of data, maybe generate something, and basically you streamline the interaction of the interface. So in my thinking, the worst case scenario is that the user tells some command to your application, underneath, the language model doesn't do exactly what we wanted, but basically the user just doesn't get the desired result. Like he sees, for example, they tried to search for something that it didn't find it, or it inserted the wrong element. So the user will be unhappy, and that's the the user of the application. So does it change anything, or is it still something that you would be very cautious about?
No, those are excellent questions. I think we're, again, still with a cautious lens in mind, but with that said, there has definitely been a lot of interest in a lot of industry conferences and other presentations I've seen where if we can not so much in the analysis of patient data leverage this, but help to maybe efficient operational, like make more efficiencies in operations on how we conduct trials.
Right.
Some of the more, you might say, manual tasks of linking information together, maybe following certain knowledge in the literature about efficient design principles. These are things that, if it doesn't involve patient privacy, that can definitely help make things faster from a streamlining perspective. But again, once that has any nugget of hitting any kind of patient level analysis, that's when the brakes will be on until we have more firm understanding of what impact that could be. But in the end, the other fundamental issue is, as you all said, these models are hosted elsewhere. These aren't like models that we've trained just on our respective companies' internal data. We know it's grabbing data from somewhere else in its training process. And of course, the risk of getting a solution that, like you said earlier, may have been built upon code that wasn't quite open source or other sources like that, that can be a big deal if that ends up being part of a submission process. So there is definitely caution around that side of development. But I do think for efficiencies and operations that we're always seeing some inroads to help make some of that process more streamlined. Because again, one of the biggest hurdles in our industry has been when we discover a treatment in the clinic, if you will, up until it gets in the hands of patients, that amount of time is quite long. And not only we can minimize all of it, but any little gain we can get in making things more efficient operationally, I think our industry is definitely looking at these types of solutions to help out.
Got it. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thanks.
And I think there's something that I've noticed with using these GPT models as well, including of course ChatGPT, is that the confidence of, for example, the explanation sometimes outweighs the solution, and it gives you the wrong solution with like a lot of confidence. And in terms of sensitive domains, even including something like education, for example, David, you deal with teaching itself, and would you suggest that? How would we kind of go around this problem where we ensure that the confidence to error ratio here isn't so wrong that people just go headfirst into the ground while learning things?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good question. So, I mean, I think about it because I actually need to redo a couple of my courses. And in one course in particular, it's for people like absolutely just starting out. I have a lesson in the end, like how do you ask questions? How do you get help? And so of course I was thinking recently, like, well, maybe I should tell people to go to ChatGPT. But and I may do that, but I think you need to give people that advice with the important caveat that it can give you wrong answers. And you need to approach it with skepticism. And not only that, for example, in all of my courses, I teach with the tidyverse. That's the approach that I use. And I could see people going to ChatGPT and asking a question and getting an answer in base art. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but if they get that answer and then are trying to compare it to the code that I've showed them, it's going to actually end up confusing them more. So I think this gets to a larger issue about how do we kind of educate people about, how do you engage with a technology like ChatGPT? I mean, my father's been, I told him about ChatGPT, so he's been going on and sending me all these kind of incorrect things that ChatGPT has told him, which he thinks is really funny. And, on the one hand, it's like, okay, yeah, it's not perfect, but there is power there. But I think educating people so that they understand to go into it with a degree of skepticism is going to be the most important thing. And I don't think that necessarily comes, it can come from within the R community, but I think that's a larger conversation about how people use AI, generally speaking, in society.
Right. Absolutely. I completely agree with that. Like interacting, like maybe prompting or like interacting with the models will be, one of the key skills on the job market in the next years, right? But understanding the issues that can come up. But if you don't tell those students what to watch out for in ChatGPT, the risk is that they will go there anyway without the knowledge and the advice from you, right? But on the other hand, the problem we're talking here, so hallucinations of models. We need to remember that the technology is evolving really fast, right? And even the GPT-4 released yesterday, it's already, like, according to some metric, I think they decreased the hallucinations by 40%. And this is just a step. It's still hallucinating, but it's not as bad as it was just a couple months ago. So we can expect this to get better. And the other thing I wanted to mention regarding privacy and sending to the APIs, I think another trend will be, like, at some point we will see models that you can have on premises, or at least in some protected environment, like the dedicated one, or models trained specifically for you. Already there's this Llama model from Meta, which is like the only public one out there of a comparable size, and people are in fact retraining this model to specific tasks. So it's not as powerful as GPT-4, but definitely this is something that I expect to be solved, at least to some extent.
I think that capability is going to be the biggest opener for using this technology more in life sciences, because a lot of what we do has to stay on-prem for security, for privacy, for all the reasons that you all can imagine. And even just getting cloud resources into our pipelines requires a lot of approvals, a lot of sign-offs from leadership. Don't even ask me how AWS got integrated, how long that took for us to leverage AWS services at my company. So this is going to be a similar workflow as this, I can imagine.
And I can see that. I mean, obviously, Eric, you work in a highly regulated industry, and so there are particular concerns there. But I think it applies to everybody. I mean, I've had this idea of building an app that does kind of summaries and other kind of analysis of qualitative data, because my background, I'm a PhD anthropologist, and so I actually come from a qualitative background. And I've thought, oh, as soon as I saw ChatGPT, I thought, well, wow, you could take this and you could apply it to, if you have a ton of interviews you've done and it's time consuming to, what a lot of people do is they kind of go in and manually code it, and that's really time consuming. Well, maybe we could use AI for that. But I posted about it on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and a lot of the response I got was, I wouldn't put my data there because I don't know, in terms of the privacy concerns and what's going to happen, is where's my data going to be stored. And I think that's absolutely the case. So, it's obviously going to show up more in regulated, highly regulated industries, but I think it's a concern for many people.
Yeah, actually, to expand on that further, this is a bit of a fun example, you might say, but in the world of podcasting, one of the things that makes things more accessible is transcripts. Having
Right.
transcripts of the conversation that you can embed in the app is a great trend. And I discovered about a month or so ago a framework called Whisper that lets you take an audio file, get the transcript, and it's pretty darn good. Like,
Yep.
it got about 95% accurate, and that's good enough for me. Instead of trying to re-listen to my episode and try to manually write it out, that's a boatload of time. And I was able to deploy that on premises, i.e. my home server I'm right next to right now. So that made me feel like, okay, I'm not sending my conversation to another training algorithm. It's using an existing model that I chose to deploy on my own with my own, you might say risk or not risk, but it's in my control. To me, that is another microcosm that if we can have more availability of these type of resources, it'll be great. But I know from the news how much resources it takes to train these models, how many millions of dollars sometimes, and who knows how much energy costs. So I'm not going to use my home server to train these models. I can guarantee that.
And I think even if this on-premise is something that I personally am looking forward to as well. And even if it was here, it would also create another problem that the development of these models would then kind of also in a way slow down, in my opinion, because right now they take all that data from all the people using it, and then they kind of retrain and do the feedback thing. So if people have that on-premise, if no one chooses to kind of send the data, then they don't have the data to train it anymore, and that creates another problem for the technological trend there as well. But then in terms of privacy concerns, I think people would
there is
Yeah.
like also the exactly opposite problem that
Yeah.
currently those models were trained on scraped data, like from all over the internet, and now when you get a lot of content generated by models, they will potentially learn on the data they generated themselves.
Yeah.
And where this will lead us,
But then, coming to the most promising use cases that you guys have seen. For example, you just mentioned Whisper, which is, I think, a great utility. And I used to podcast, so I know transcripts are incredibly hard. And especially if you use some app, usually they get most of it wrong, and then you have to manually correct that. So that's another problem. So what are the most promising use cases you've seen, and which you think can be improved with these models in right now with the GPT-4, let's say, at this level, at this stage?
All right, so let me start with the software development stream, and now maybe you guys will expand on also the other, like the features that you see can come up. So definitely, I can see a lot of speed up in how we work in developing applications, and it will start from applications code or solutions analysis, if you can do that, and learning to do stuff. But then you can expect the frameworks to start being developed faster, because if you get a speed up like of a factor of like 2 or 3 to how fast you can develop code, you will be also make faster progress with frameworks. So the more important it will be, your conceptual approach to actually the hardest things, like how do you design the API, what do you want the interface to be, how we communicate the stuff that you have here, there. But specifically about how we develop Shiny applications, because this is the closest to me personally. A lot of stuff that, starting from setting up the structure of the application for a specific task, application layout, definitely, we've seen already examples in the toy application that I built yesterday with the new model. It can already generate some layout to your description. The CSS code, JavaScript code, for example, you can imagine our developer that is really not that fluent with JavaScript, but they can add a lot more interactivity using generated code. And if there's any bug, like an obvious error, they can just copy paste it back to GPT to get a fixed version. But the problem is when the bugs are non-obvious, right? And it mostly kind of works, but there are some edge cases. So that's something I'm not like. I think that we need programmers that fully understand what they are putting in the code, even if it's generated. But it can really speed you up, like tasks like write a function that draws a plot that looks this and that. For me, ggplot arguments, it was like really I couldn't remember all the different arguments for ggplot, and here it's like it's instant. Writing documentation like Roxygen, descriptions of functions, just to start you. Like I always assume that I will edit this later, but it's already speeds you up. I know that many people at Epsilon are experimenting with test cases. So like test that tests. It really works, at least in our experience. If you ask ChatGPT to write tests from scratch, it will not work that well. But if you give it one or two initial tests, it can just expand your test coverage to different cases. One final use case I found, which I think is really interesting. I saw someone who posted about how they took some existing application and asked GPT-4 to provide a security and safety review, basically, as a kind of acting as a senior engineer, and it found all kinds of memory leaks, security issues, unhandled exceptions, and so on. So this is kind of stuff that it can really help a lot. Like it worked really well. So maybe that let's end here. Like I could go on and on, but definitely that's one area, and also like features in the applications, like as I mentioned, making the UI of applications much faster and more pleasant to interact with. That's I think is a huge area.
Well, I think Marek gets at you've talked about kind of like two ways of using AI at this point, which is one on the development side, how do we use it to help us write code, and then two is on the analysis side, like can we use AI to do analysis. I think it's pretty clear that at this point it's ready and can be very helpful on the development side. I think there are a lot more questions that things we've brought up on the analysis side. So, if you're thinking like watching this panel and then thinking, okay, what can I take from it and use? I would say, yeah, absolutely go for it on the development side. But I think the thing that I've seen at least is you have to know kind of like the right questions to ask. I mean, I've used it in a similar way. I needed to write some PHP. I know a very little bit of PHP, but I knew what I was trying to do, and I knew I could ask ChatGPT in a way that it could give me the answer. For someone just starting out, they're not even going to know, what's the right question, what's the way to frame, like, how do I frame this question? So again, if you can provide that context and know how to ask those questions, I think it can work for development. Again, I'd be pretty cautious about any kind of analysis beyond kind of fun stuff at this point.
Those great nuggets there. I think having, like, someone might say online, oh, is this going to replace my job as a developer? No, it's not. It's not there yet. It may never be there yet. It is a companion, you might say. In fact, you might think of it as like a virtual pair programmer. If you know you don't have the expertise in some other framework that you're hooking your Shiny app in or other pipeline in, it can help you get along on that side of it. And maybe you don't have enough domain knowledge to know if the answer, quote unquote, is the best way to do it. But to get started is certainly is a great help. And then you can find a human set of eyes to look at that with you later on, and you can see just how far off or how close that was to something that a human would recommend. So I think development side, we're definitely aligned on that. And again, for my industry, the last thing we ever want to give any hint of is that we are doing an analysis that goes out of bounds, if you will, of what we pre-specify when we do a controlled experiment. Now, it does get a little muddy when I mentioned earlier this real world analytics situation, but even then we still often pre-specify our analysis strategy before we actually carried it out, even if it's not in the strict clinical trial perspective. So we would just have to be cautious if we did try to dive into a little bit of analytical help, that we have the human eyes to either say this complements what we already said, or this is way out of bounds, because these algorithms are not going to know the context of what questions we're trying to answer from like a research perspective. They're not going to have that. I think this is definitely an area where the human element's not going away. So nobody worry about your having to look for a job because of this. It's all to help, but it's not going to replace the human intervention.
I absolutely agree with what you said, Eric. That it's not gonna replace people like software engineers or data scientists, and going with the theme that David introduced. What can you take from this talk? I think what I can see happening is, for example, for software engineers. I can imagine new skills being more important. Like they're important now, but I can imagine them getting more important. Like, for example, design, user experience, this kind of stuff. So like, knowing what you need to do and knowing how to talk to users of your application, and decide how to shape those features and what to tell the model. This may get more important. So I think it's always like, even without GPT, those skills are important and super beneficial. And this is something that I would look at and consider investing in those skills.
I like how this conversation naturally flowed into some of the questions that we already had. And there were some questions about how it can be counterproductive to learning, which I think David already answered. And there are some questions from the audience that we would like to pick up still. So one of them is, do you see originality or creativity getting extinct, or just being curbed a little if these models, for example, get used a lot? Given that they would always kind of give the same answers, is what my assumption is from what the question is asking.
That's quite interesting. Oh, you go ahead, David. You go first.
Well, the question was about whether creativity will kind of become extinct. I mean, personally, I actually think the opposite will happen. I think the ChatGPT is really good, but for example, when it comes to writing, which is something I do a lot of, it's pretty bland in terms of what it returns to you. And so, and I think you can extend that to other domains, I imagine, as well. In a lot of ways, I think people who are able to be creative and not produce things that are that could be produced by AI will become even more apparent because there'll be just so much more use of tools that produce kind of similar bland content in a lot of ways. Eric, I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, actually, you took that very nicely. I think it's going to be easier to have an easier way to detect when something has been created with a human element in mind. Certainly, I think of creating Shiny apps as a bit of an art as well as the technical science behind it. And certainly my style of apps is going to look different than maybe some of the others on my team or in my organization. And I am absolutely fine with that because in the end, we're getting our job done. And to each, I'd say different strokes for different folks. And if we start seeing these canned set of routines in a module or another paradigm, it'll be pretty obvious to those that know something like Shiny pretty well. Yeah, he or she got a little help with that. I think that'll be easier to detect. Hopefully, I'm thinking for more somebody coming new to a framework that they don't use it as a crutch for advancing their skill set. It can be potentially easy for somebody newer to the industry to kind of fall into the trap of, hey, you know what? I'm just going to use this all the time. You still need to challenge yourself a little bit because that's the only way you learn is you really challenge yourself. At least in the early days of Shiny, it was quite challenging. So I had to learn a lot the hard way. Not to be like one of those people of like get off my lawn syndrome, but it's like that is the best way to learn sometimes, to go through it yourself, understand the pros and cons of the solution. You're not going to get that context with a somewhat canned response that you might get from a ChatGPT assistance.
Oh, that's Eric. That's actually a super interesting thought. I think I will think about it more because, like, how people will learn in the future when they have those models. Will they be challenged enough to go deep into some skills and knowledge? And about creativity, I fully agree with like David. You put it the perfect way. I think one thing that I can add. I think we can expect to see the same thing that we saw in art, like images, right? Like there's a new area of art which is generated images with generative adversarial networks. So we can see the same in prose, for example. So absolutely new ways to be creative.
So I think we're kind of completely in time. So I'll try my best to summarize everything that you have said. And I think it's a question of society and ethics and how things will evolve. As David said, it also is about how we learn to use these things. And I think with the internet itself, we came to, we took our time to actually learn how to use the internet correctly. Then trust but verify. Always trust but verify. If you need to know that it's giving you the correct answer. So be cautious. Then we are going to look forward to more on-premise solutions, and we want to protect the privacy of our data, and most people would actually tend to lean that way. Then you must also know what you want to get from it, because if you know what you get from it, it makes it better for you to structure that prompt. Also, it actually makes you better at what you do. So that's definitely necessary for you to be differentiated in this world of auto-generated everything. And no, it is not replacing your job, not yet. And with that, I would like to thank all of you. This was amazing. I think we can keep going on and on, but then we have to get back to schedule. And I really appreciate you giving us this time. This was so insightful. Thank you again. Have a great day, please.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was great.